for. Wow. Zope, like Django, tends to be the highest profile in terms of attach rate. There's some pretty big organizations that have built their web portals based on Zope. This is the AARP organization. And finally, for additional information on Model View Controller, I would recommend Wikipedia. As you know by now, if you've taken other courses by me with CBT Nuggets, I'm a big fan of Wiki. Their Model View Controller article is pretty good. It's not the best, but it's still a really good starting point for understanding how this software architecture works. I also wanted to show you a couple screenshots of the administrative website for Django and Zope in particular. There's not a whole lot to see. As you see, the Django administration site is pretty darn elegant, and that's really the point. A lot of CBT Nuggets customers come from a Microsoft background, so perhaps you're used to the SharePoint server interface, which is quite cluttered indeed. SharePoint is the same basic idea as these Python-based web application frameworks, although SharePoint uses Microsoft SQL Server, of course, as its backend, and uses ASP.NET, that's Microsoft's competitor to PHP, as its application logic and presentation language. I also have a screenshot I found of Zope, again a very simple, elegant interface, and that's about all there is to it. Now let's shift our attention to Python Integrated Development Environments, or IDEs. Of course, we've been doing most of our work in this series thus far in an IDE. Of course, we've been using IDLE, which does have some of these features you see in this list that I pulled from a really nifty article on StackOverflow.com. When we're looking for an IDE, we're looking for something that's obviously going to support our language. The Microsoft Visual Studio application IDE is not going to get us very far. In fact, it's not going to get us anywhere with regard to Python. Of course, if we're using IronPython or Jython, there are IDEs for those environments. This is a list of features, IDE features, that the professional programmers at Stack Overflow thought were useful for comparative purposes. Is the IDE cross-platform? Does it run natively on Windows, Mac OS X, Linux? Is it commercial or free? Do we have code completion? Do we have localization with language? Do we have a debugging environment that's integrated into the IDE? Can we mark up errors and exceptions? Is there source control integration? As you develop more experience with programming, especially once you join a development team, you're absolutely going to be using version control software. A popular one is Subversion, which is often abbreviated to SVN. These are code repositories that are nothing more than a safe place for code to be, such that developers can check out and check back in modules, and it keeps track of changes, so there's revision tracking, and also, even more importantly, prevents your code from getting stepped on against somebody maybe overwriting code that you've just put in, or two folks trying to access the same file at the same time, etc. Smart indentation is useful, such that depending upon what you're doing, like in IDLE, for instance, if we open up a header line with a colon and then press enter, you get the 4-tab indent. Of course, indentation is crucial in Python, so this is a really must-have feature for us. Bracket matching isn't so useful in Python, but it is for a language like C#. Any of the C languages that use braces to denote the beginning and end of routines. Line numbers I find to be particularly important, and one of IDLE's biggest weakness, the fact that IDLE doesn't number lines. When you're sharing codes with your colleagues, you definitely want to be able to reference line numbers in your code. UML is a markup language that we can use to design interfaces, design relational databases, design software systems. It's a modeling language, actually. Visio, for instance, the Microsoft Visio application, has built-in UML templates. Again, as you get out into the industry and start working as a software developer, you doubtless will begin using UML. Code folding means that you can expand or collapse sections of your code. As your Python script file gets more complex, you'll find that code folding can really simplify your view. Code templates is exactly what you think, a nice way to reuse code and just open up boilerplate script files that already have your header and your generic document strings placed, etc. Does the IDE have built-in unit testing? Testing is a very important, crucial phase of software development that as a topic is beyond our scope in this course, but if your IDE does have built-in debugging and unit testing capabilities, all to the good. Is there an integrated GUI designer? We've already talked about Qt. Eric is another GUI platform. We learned a bunch of them, actually. As you saw from our demo with tkinter, it's not the most fun you'll ever have in the world building graphical user interfaces manually with code. It's much, much easier to use a graphical builder, in my opinion. Do we have seamless integration with databases? If we're working with Python frameworks, chances are you're looking at a database like MySQL or PostgreSQL, but you also could just as well be plugging into some of the big commercial systems like Oracle, IBM DB2, and Microsoft SQL Server 2008. And then finally, does the IDE support what's called rapid application development? Again, when we're trying to pick out representative examples of web application frameworks and now IDEs, it involves quite a bit of research, but ultimately this is a selective process. What I finally narrowed the list down to are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of what I and a lot of other Python programmers in the world feel are the best IDEs available for Python for one reason or another. You'll notice that 2 of these are commercial and they cost actually a fair bit of money. ActiveState, who as we know publishes their own distribution of Python, has an excellent IDE called Komodo. Their Komodo Edit is a smaller free version of their IDE. The enterprise version is called Komodo IDE, and that does cost. The other one that costs, but in my opinion it's really worth it if you're going to get into Python development in depth, is from Wingware. Their Wing IDE Pro is especially suited for learners, in my opinion. They have a lot of really useful code lookup utilities built into the IDE that makes understanding the connection, for instance, between imported libraries and your top-level module file a lot easier to visualize. Another extremely popular IDE is Eclipse. Now, Eclipse is a language-neutral framework. That is to say, Eclipse is an IDE host or shell into which you can plug in your development environment of choice. Therefore, if we're going to use Eclipse with Python development, we're going to need to download Eclipse. Technically, you just need the much smaller Eclipse runtime environment. I have installed the entire thing on my system. And then from Eclipse, you can download and install what's called the PyDev plugin. This gives you Python support in the Eclipse IDE. NetBeans is another platform-neutral IDE written in Java that does support Python among many other languages. I frankly prefer NetBeans to Eclipse. Eclipse I find to be very complex. I hope that if you're in an environment where you're programming using Eclipse that you have some really good teachers to show you the ropes, because it's not easy. Finally,